Oh, I see participants are starting to come in. And I will wait just a moment while the room fills. Welcome, everybody. I'm seeing, the participants are starting to come in, so I'm going to hold off a formal commencement until the numbers seem to settle, but they seem to be getting there. We've got about, I think, 35 folks, and I think it's about time for us to begin. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to all of you out there in Zoom land, which I think is all of us, to our eagerly anticipated conversation with Elizabeth Colomba today. My name is Chris McDonough. We're coming to you from the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. Our guest today is the renowned artist, Mademoiselle Elizabeth Colomba, whom my colleague, Professor Stephanie McCarter, will introduce in just a moment. Our conversation today is sponsored by the Classics Department, by the University Lectures Committee, and by the Office of Vice Chancellor Nancy Berner, in specific support of the 50th anniversary of two landmark legislative advances for women's rights in the United States, the extension of Title VII to educational institutions to include women, and the breakthrough passage of Title IX. We are grateful for the support. Let me say a few words on how we're going to proceed. Our Mademoiselle Colomba will give a brief presentation on her work, and then we'll turn to the discussion. We have two primary interlocutors today. The first is Olivier Mbabazi from Kigali, Rwanda, who will graduate from the University of the South this spring with a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Arts and in French and French Studies. Earlier this month, he was awarded a Watson Fellowship to spend a year pursuing the topic of art and human resilience, and he's also been accepted to a number of MFA programs in Canada and the United States. Our second interlocutor is Professor Stephanie McCarter, who teaches here at the University of the South and is a renowned translator of Horace, and her translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses will be coming up from Penguin later on this year. And those of you on Zoom, please note that the chat has been disabled, except for communication with the panelists, just to let us know if there are technical problems or other things of that sort that need to be attended to. Questions, however, will be allowed in the Q&A function, which you should see down at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring those, and will be, looking to I'll give voice to those particular questions as they come up. The way that we're going to proceed is that Olivier, I think, will be asking the first set of questions, and then Professor McCarter, and then I'll look to Zoom. And that, I think, is enough out of me. Let me turn to my colleague, Professor Stephanie McCarter, who will introduce our guest speaker for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I am honored to introduce our guest, Elizabeth Colomba. Mademoiselle Colomba is an acclaimed figurative painter who hails originally from France and is now based in New York City. Her paintings have been exhibited around the world, from the California African American Museum in Los Angeles to Gracie Mansion in New York, to the Balthus Grand Chalet in Switzerland, to the International Biennial of Contemporary Art in Martinique. Her work is included in the permanent collections of the Studio Museum in Harlem, Princeton University, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Her new painting of an exquisite Minerva, which you can see before you, about which she will speak to us shortly, now permanently graces the Park Avenue Armory in New York. Her paintings recreate well-known subject matter in new, compelling ways, taking up themes from religion, from history, and from mythology, the last of which will be our focus today. Colomba's work both invokes and challenges the European canon of figurative painting, confronting its traditional omission of Black women on the one hand, and its servile representation of Black women on the other. Her art thereby resituates those traditionally excluded from the Eurocentric canon at its very center. It is not just her centering of Black women in European-style art that gives her work its power. It is also her exploration of the gaze, particularly the feminine gaze, her focus on the agency of often disempowered mythical women, and her keen interest in the body, how it has been objectified or erased, and how in turn it might be reclaimed and empowered. My own interest in her work arose in the context of a course I taught on contemporary women reworking material from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Her work led to some of the best discussions we had, and was a particular favorite of many of the students, some of whom are in our audience today. Mademoiselle Colomba joins us today from San Francisco, where she flew just this morning for another exhibit. And so we are tremendously grateful for her making the time to speak with us about her beautiful, important work. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this beautiful summary of my life. That's fabulous. And I wish I could, welcome you in my studio in New York. I think it would be more aesthetic and pleasing aesthetically, but unfortunately, I'm here in San Francisco in a, meek hotel room. Maybe next time. So, do you want me to start a little bit talking about how I became an artist? Maybe?
Absolutely, that would be wonderful. Speak to us about how you became an artist, your process, and let me know if there are specific images you would like me to progress to as we move through with the PowerPoint.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Maybe the next slide. I don't remember what it is, but maybe.
Is right.
Oh yeah, good idea. So I am originally from France, from Paris, France, and I'm from Martinique descent. My parents are from Martinique, and I went to art school in Paris, France, and studied for a long time. And I always was interested in the technique and the classical way of painting, the craftsmanship. But I really focused on representing black bodies within this manner when I first encountered a painting called Portrait of a Negress. He now has been uh, called Portrait of Madeleine, as we found her name. And I think it was a field trip for school, and we were in the Louvre, and as we walk in the hallway, we passed this gorgeous painting, Portrait of Madeleine, and it stopped me in my tracks because it was the first time that I encountered not only a black woman painted at that time, but also the fact that she's taking the whole space of the canvas. She was, front and center, the main actress of this movie. That was this, painting. And it sparked something in me, and maybe it's something that I try to recreate throughout my practice and throughout the years. Is that moment of feeling seen and feeling included in a history that you have made. It. So it really guided me on the path of really focusing on how to tell different stories, and definitely storytelling is at the center of my work, and make the protagonist look like me, essentially. So I usually navigate between four themes, as you can see. One of them is mythology, and we will talk about this one more extensively. Allegory, history, and feminine sacred, which encompasses everything that is biblical story, any kind of religious story, and those themes are also something that all masters used to do and represent in their practice. And I thought it was interesting, if I was including the black body in a history, I wanted to be able to use not only the same technique, but also the same way of telling the story, and to then interrogate how it changes the meaning of it, right? So, and mythology, obviously, and we're going to talk more about all those themes. I think if you can go through the next, I believe the next slide would, yes. So before we dive into, the iconography and meaning and storytelling, I want to tell you a little bit about the process, which is very similar to, masters like Vermeer and Ingres, which is an old technique, but still being used today. So first, I start with obviously I find something I want the story I want to tell. I start with a study, And the study I projected on the canvas. So that's why you see all those squares. It's a grid system. And then after that, I do what I call a grisaille, which is what you call in English dead layer, which is completely black and white. And with that, I work with layered colors. In French, it's a glacis, but it's just um, layers onto layers onto layers. So it creates that kind of depth and that kind of light in the painting. And it's it's a long technique. It's not something that that you need to, because it's oil painting, so obviously it needs to dry and all that. But I really wanted to channel that type of work to be able to really to make the effect almost uncanny, and really that it could work toward next to all masters painting. It's really challenging, almost time. I think we can go to the next slide. Ah, there she is. The Minerva. So Minerva was commissioned by an institution called the Park Armory Avenue in New York, which it used to be a military club, and almost like a reserve. It was basically, they were prepared. It was a place for them to be prepared to go to war, but they actually never went. So it was a regiment, and it was mainly men just hanging around and thinking they can go to war, but really they were never called for. And I believe in the last war, I think it was Second World War, when finally one of the regiment got called, they were absolutely disastrous, and unfortunately a lot of them lost their lives because they never really had any kind of they were not formed to fight in combat. So it was a bit of a disaster. But all that to say that now the Park Armory is a place that hosts beautiful art events. They are focusing more on exploring, artistry. They're doing exhibitions very regularly, whether it's music, obviously artists, contemporary artists, opera, concerts. I mean, it's a very interesting way. It's a very interesting departure from where they went, and it's also a place that had extensive renovation because it was an abandoned building afterwards. So the reason why they approached me is because I think in 2017 they wanted to do a pop-up show that only lasted a day, and there was this artist also, Carrie Wims, that was also curating the room, and this other artist, Deborah Willis, who wanted to curate a room, and she decided to do that room with my work. And the impression was so great on visitors when they came in and they saw this black woman populating the walls of one room. And I have to say that just to give you a context, that the rooms, all the walls in the Park Armory are portraits of white military men. So you have Washington, you have you have Hoover, so, because you have also leaders or officials. You have Lafayette. You have all this basically everywhere. So when they entered the room and they saw these paintings of black women, they were not only puzzled, but they even thought, well, maybe they didn't know this part of history, and that indeed maybe black women were in the Park Armory. So it was interesting that it sparked a very intense conversation. So with that effect, a few years later, they approached me to maybe try to find a figure to paint and to stay permanently at the Park Armory. So I thought about Minerva, because Minerva is the goddess that encompasses both. She is goddess of war, but contrary to her counterpart, who's Mars, she's fighting war with the mind in a way. She is more about strategy than fighting with fists and weapons. So I thought it was interesting, but also she's the goddess of the arts. And I thought, because of the Park Armory has only this war past, but today is the art. They're involved in the art. I thought it was almost the embodiment, perfect embodiment for who they were today. And I decided to represent her that way. And you see in the painting, you have different elements that reminds you of Minerva. So you have the owl, obviously, on the right-hand side. You have the shield that you can't really see here, but it's the shield that was given to her by Perseus with a Medusa on its face. You have the spear, which is also a symbol of strength. You have the laurel on her head that was given to victors, or I think also poets. That's what I think it's called, laureates. It's coming from there. And also the fact that it's populated with a flute in the foreground, and she's also almost like carving this statue in the back, which actually is the statue of Cordier, which is a Venus. And on the left side, you have a bust of Minerva, a more traditional representation of Minerva, which I think is an Italian bust from the 17th century. If I'm not mistaken, do not quote me on that precisely. And on the right side, you have a painting of a swan, which alludes to Zeus when he changed himself into a swan to seduce Leda, I believe. And Zeus was the father of Minerva, because I think she was born out of his head. So I think all these elements are here to for us to understand who is this character, and why she was chosen to be really part of the Park Armory Avenue.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. I just had a wonderful time looking at this painting for quite a long time the other night after you sent me these images. So it's really spectacular. Olivier, would you like to ask Mademoiselle Colomba a question?
Absolument, oui. Yes. So thank you very much. My first question is, why in many of your works do you portray single individuals, or like one character by themselves and mainly placed indoors as opposed to being outside?
Well, indoors, indoors started with, and I think also a single female, started with my influence of Dutch masters. It started with Vermeer, which in most of his paintings are, it's a single persona and it's interiors. And I like the idea of the intimacy of an interior. That's what it evoked to me when I saw Vermeer. And I feel I kind of want to emulate that, almost that cocooning moment that you create a world from bottom to, that you have some control on it, and you have control in a closed space. And I wanted to populate this each room with all elements that this character is telling me. So most of the time, that's why I explore interiors, and also why I have a single female. But also, I like the idea of the female, and I was talking also about this painting I saw in the Louvre. I just like that they're taking that space by themselves and occupy it strongly, in a powerful way, and there's no other distraction as people. So I think that's why I'm focusing on that.
Thank you.
Let me just say, if anybody wants to ask a question, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A. If anything occurs to you, I think that's enabled, and I'm just I will look at those as we go along. I think Professor McCarter is going to take up a question at this point, though.
Thank you. So yeah, I want to zoom to Daphne, which is the painting that, my students and I really spent a long time thinking about this painting. And my question about this is just sort of focusing on this, is why Daphne in particular? So I think this sort of branches out to a larger question, which is why are you turning to mythology? And I guess one question is, are you turning to mythology because it is the subject matter of the particular artists that influence you, or are you looking to mythology because of its sort of centrality to, the storytelling that you're so interested in? So I suppose, why myth? Why Daphne? And why not other mythologies? Why are you looking specifically to Greco-Roman mythology as to find subject matter for your work?
I like mythology. Thank you for your question first. I like mythology because I like the universality of it. I think there's always a message that everybody can identify and understand. And there's something so imperfect about, all those gods and goddesses that is very intriguing, and you can build up on that. It also, because I obviously try to recreate almost a parallel history, and I like the idea that all those masters were using also the same thing. And I want to recreate or reimagining the same story with other characters playing the roles. And how I choose the myth, it really depends on what moves me. For example, what I like about Daphne, and I would add that it's changing also how those female characters are perceived, whether it's perceived by me, a black woman, or by old masters. And I want them to have a more they're more involved into their story, not only just passing characters. So, for example, Daphne, the fact I wanted her to stand in and confront whoever is coming behind this wall. The story of Daphne is this beautiful girl who has Apollo running after her with only one goal: the idea that he's gonna rape her by the end. Right? That's the idea of it. That's his goal. Because obviously she refuses to him, and he insists. So, and in the story, she calls on to father, and she escapes Apollo at the last minute because she metamorphoses into a laurel tree. And then she escapes, right? But she needed the help of someone else. And I wanted her in that moment, let's say, confronting the person who is willing to do harm to her and say, well, you know what? I might lose this fight because, it's Apollo, it's a god. It's likely she will lose. But I might lose this fight, but I will still try. She would fight, she will not flee the scene. And I wanted her to be hiding into the laurel tree, sneaking with the arrow in her hand, which is one of the arrows that was used to shoot her, and turn it against her enemy. So I think it's also the idea of, yes, taking a myth that is existing, but reading it differently. And maybe give it find another spin to the same story with different characters, which is also very charged when you think about also the parallel story of Daphne and women of color who were in bondage and who could not fight their aggressor. So I think it's an interesting parallel of reading this story differently.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat just at the moment, and so perhaps Olivier, I will let you proceed.
Sure.
I can also maybe define a little bit the iconography in the painting.
I would love that. I have a particular question on that, but I'm not gonna.
So I wanted to give hints of who she is. So you see the laurel tree in the back, where she's trying to almost morph with the wallpaper. You have the Bernini statue, which is the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, I believe, which is the symbol of what Apollo would like to do, right? And you have symbols of Apollo also in the table, because you have a lyra. The foot of the table is the shape of a lyra, And also in the background, on the banquette, you also have a layer but shaped as a turtle, because it's also there is I like to make also the illusion of the empire, which the Roman Empire, which also possessed part of North Africa and Africa, and there is this also this other myth that I tried to do a series on called Psyche and Eros, and Apuleius at the time was born in the place which today will be Ethiopia. So I like also to give hints in the painting about what happened with the Roman Empire and where it was located geographically.
Go ahead, Olivier. I'm sorry. I'll restrain myself.
Thank you. My other question is, could you tell us a little bit more about the women in your paintings? I read your interview with Vogue, and I heard that sometimes you depict women from your life, like your relatives, your mother, your grandmother, or your friends. But could you elaborate on that? What is that process like? How do you choose to pick these individuals?
Well, it depends on. Thank you for your question, Olivier. It depends on the subject matter. I mean, I'm not sure if we can maybe switch to Four Seasons. I believe it's in there. Oh no, it cannot be because it's mythology. We did not choose that. I don't think I have a model. I use a model of anybody from my family or friends in mythology, which is interesting. But a lot of my, I like to choose my, depending on the theme, I'm choosing family or friends to represent Black women because I like the idea of having some sort of emotional link to them. But also sometimes it's just this face embodies the story. And it happens, for example, for Daphne, somebody I didn't know very well, and I still don't know, that I met socially. And you approach people. I say, well, you explain your situation. I'm a painter, I think, and it can sound incredibly sleazy, but but you have to show your legitimacy, and you explain that you have this idea, and that they will fit the part, I would say. And usually people are very open to it. It's easier now just because we are so used to have phone on our face and selfies and all that, so people are just more inclined to pose rogue for me.
A question has appeared in the chat, and so let me go ahead and ask it. And then I think that after that, Professor McCarter, I think I will let you pick up. There's so many things, so many threads we want to follow up on. I can just tell. A student asks, I have never seen an aesthetic like yours before. Can you talk about how you develop your color palettes and style in general?
Well, I think with time, it's but again, being you observe old masters and their technique, you observe their color palette, and then you find your own, because it's also important not to completely copy. So and you see the evolution. Definitely in my younger work, you can really feel the weight, I would say, of Dutch masters specifically, and their aesthetic and the color palette and even the way I was telling the story. So with time you evolve, and you obviously I still love the technique, and I still love the way they treat light, but I'm mixing it also with the things I want, and you discover yourself throughout the years. And I found out that my palette color is warmer than Dutch masters, let's say, probably just because of the way where they painted, which is in Holland, which is a little bit blue as a light. And I also work, I mean, it's kind of technical, but I also work with a color wheel to understand which colors goes together, which one is opposition, when they are side by side, do they work? which one will lift up the other. So there's still a technical idea behind it. I do also very swatches of colors. When I finish the grisaille, it's a very daunting moment because then I have to jump into colors. And usually I have colors in my head and I think it's going to work, and sometimes all of a sudden it's not working. So it's the idea of, you put swatches together and you see how they work, and you can have, let's say, a color in the same family. It might not be exactly this one, but maybe there will be a bit of, a hint. It will be warmer or maybe a little bit greener, and then it just creates something that is more harmonious. So.
Go ahead, Stephanie. Yeah.
Oh, and unless, do you have a follow-up?
The questions are coming in. Why don't you go ahead? Yeah.
Okay. I just want to ask, I just have just a couple more quick ones, hopefully. So one, I think, staying with the idea that you incorporate so many known objects into your painting. When I see the Daphne and I see the Bernini statue next to her, of course, I'm also thinking of the very well-known statue of Bernini's, Apollo and Daphne statue, which I happen to have a little replica of right here.
Yes.
And so I guess, and then I'm thinking also, for example, if we look at the painting of Ceres, you have the Ingres painting above her. And one thing I really love here is how her direct gaze out at the viewer is mirroring Zeus's direct gaze from that painting, or Jupiter, which, if we're going to go with Greek or Roman. But and so I'm curious, what is the relationship between the objects that you are incorporating into your painting and then the message of the painting itself? I mean, with the Bernini, it seems to me that you're both invoking and challenging Bernini. And so I'm just curious, what is the relationship between the art that you are producing and the art that you are incorporating?
Well, it's what I like about using objects. It's what it adds on to the story. It's almost like a puzzle. It's you identify something and you identify something else, and then it creates a story. It's like the iconography. It's almost like a treasure search where you feel like you understand something, and then you find another object. I mean, for example, in Ceres, you have, Jupiter, and then you have the time. So then, what time? And then you understand that time was her father, right? And then you have the mother, which is, the other statue. That's why they are nestled almost together like a family. You have Jupiter, Ceres, Kronos, and I don't remember the name of her mother. And it's all of these are clues for you, basically. And I just like the idea of discovery. I think it always fascinated me in paintings like Da Vinci or Ingres or Rubens or Rembrandt. You have all these little things, or even like the meaning of a color, what it means. It adds on to the narrative of the painting, and it's a pleasure for me to do it because I just like having different layers to a story. But also, it's not necessary to understand the painting as a whole, but it really gives you more depth.
Olivia, why don't you go ahead and follow up? I'm just sort of sorting through questions here that I'd like to follow up on as well.
Sure. So my following question pertains just a little bit far from mythology. I'm more curious about your practice in the context of contemporary art, place, or market. What has it been to practice this old master style in the contemporary world, which is mostly, well, or largely abstract? How do you navigate that space in general? Yeah.
I would say it's the beginning of the adventure was not easy, but it's getting easier now because thanks to, I would say, artists like Kehinde Wiley, who has been, obviously our style are different, but they're similar because we're using we're referencing old masters. So and you will see more and more that it populates actually contemporary world right now. You have somebody like him, because you have the layers of figurative art, which already was not as popular 10 years ago. So now you have more and more of that. You have Kehinde Wiley, you have Amy Sherald, you have Jordan Castile, you have all these incredible artists who are figurative artists. And certainly somebody like Kehinde Wiley, with his eternal reference to old masters, made this genre, let's say, more popular. But it's not an easy road and to navigate, and it's challenging, but I feel it's worth it to tell a different story.
Gosh, I'm so glad to hear you speak about Kehinde Wiley's work. I mean, it strikes me that there's so much that your work is in dialogue with there. And I've got to say, I just really love this encre that you've done. That must be fun to actually paint, you know?
It is.
Is it? I mean, can you say just a little bit about that? I mean, is it fun to just sort of channel Ong or Bernini?
It's fun and challenging at the same time, because obviously I for example, this painting, I wanted to have a representation of Jupiter, because I believe it's called Jupiter in the Ingres painting is called Jupiter, I think.
And Venus, yeah.
And I'm looking for representation of him in throughout the art, and then I'm seeing this beautiful Ingres painting, and I'm like, oh my God, this is the one I would like to do. And it's challenging because it's Ingres or it's Bernini. They're still incredible masters, incredible crafts, and it's almost a bit arrogant to try to represent them yourself in your work. So it's both, but you learn a lot also. You learn on techniques, you learn to improve, you learn on color. So it's always a good time to be humble and revisit a lot of things.
Will it be okay if I just take a couple from the chat? One person asks about your choices of clothing and dress for the subjects in your painting. And then we've also got a question about grief and lamentation. And then finally, another one about the sort of trans-historical nature of empire. I don't know whether or not you feel like picking up all of those or one of those.
So I'll start with the first one, which is the choice of clothing. So choice of clothing is between, I would say, 17th century to essentially end of or beginning of 20th century, maybe sometimes. And so from time to time, I refer to the 20th or 21st century. For example, in this very one, Sarah's, you can't really see the dress, right? But it's actually a contemporary dress from a French designer called Olivier Mbabazi. And I thought it was interesting because Olivier Mbabazi is mixed, I think black. He doesn't know himself. There was a beautiful documentary about him recently on Netflix where he's searching for his identity. But at the time I didn't know, obviously. But I thought it was interesting that he was from mixed heritage. And I kind of wanted to incorporate that because it's very rare, definitely, to have a maison or a house of this sort to be led by a black man or a brown person. So I kind of wanted to put that in there. So this one actually is a contemporary dress. But most of the time I focus fashion, which in a span of 200 years, which was roughly 250 years, which was roughly the time that Black people were in bondage in America or in the Caribbean.
Professor McCarter, I think that. Oh, I'm sorry, Stephanie. I think it's your turn to ask something.
Am I unmuted? Okay. I am interested in. I have two questions, and I'm trying to decide which one to ask because I want to leave plenty of time. let me ask you this, because I think I know the answer to my other question, and I don't know the answer to this one. With your use of iconography, your use of known paintings, known objects, it seems like there's a language, right, that you have to sort of know to be able to read. And and having studied myth now for more years than I would like to admit, and taught it, I've been teaching at Sewanee since 2008. I've been thinking about myth and Ovid since then. And still I have moments where I'm like, I don't really have to think about exactly how this is working. But it is delightful to be able to do that. But I am curious then about your viewers, right? The people who are viewing this, who are you painting for? I guess that's my question. Given that they can read this sort of symbolism of your paintings. So who in your mind's eye is your audience? Does that make sense?
Yeah, everything makes sense. In my mind, everybody is my audience. Ultimately, I would like people to be moved by the work, regardless of the understanding iconography, or having the little notebook with all the meaning of all the objects. The idea is that the first impression of the work, you love it or maybe hate it, and that's what matters. And if you're interested into it, then you would look further, because there will be more than meets the eye. So maybe you do more research and you'll be more interested, and then even more you get to unpeel the painting and discover what's inside. But really, hopefully, my goal is to paint for whoever will be moved by this type of work.
My hope is that somebody would see the series here and ask, why is there a lizard on her shoulder, and start to investigate that that particular story. Yes, it's really wonderful, and a delight for my students to puzzle through. We love it. Yeah.
And also there's obviously my interpretation as an artist, because I put a lot of thought into it, and all this means something. But what's incredible when I encounter people who don't have, let's say, the clue or the knowledge, the depth they go into finding things about my own painting that I didn't think about, and it makes sense. What they are telling me is making as much sense as the one I created originally. And I think that's the beauty about art, is that it can have many signification, because it depends on your experience. It depends on your past, and it depends on your story. So hopefully this is universal.
Olivia, I'm certain you must have a follow-up question on that point.
I do actually. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about just like creating a different story, or reclaiming history in some cases. And my question is, in that process, sometimes there is implications of erasure or concealment or correction of older versions of the stories that are being narrated. And my question is, how do you reconcile those complexities around that phenomenon?
Well, I understand where we could think that it's almost a rewriting of the history, or just like trying to wash over it, but because these myths exist visually differently, and I'm telling a parallel story which enhance how I'm sorry. Oops. Which enhances and underline how we lived as Black people differently than when those original painting was created. So I think instead of revisiting it, it's revisiting a story, but I think it highlights what did not happen, and therefore makes you think of what happened, and how unfortunately this plays into the present.
Thank you very much.
I think that's so interesting. And Stephanie, I think I was cutting you off earlier, and I apologize about that. Did you have a follow-up question on the point before? You're good. Well, we've got a couple of interesting, quite a few questions here that are so interesting. I'd like to combine two of them. One is a person asks, what is your preferred medium to work with? And another person asks, what are you currently working on?
Ah. My preferred medium is oil, but I do work with watercolors. I am in the process of doing a series of large-scale watercolor, which I did not present here because it's not mythology. But I do love watercolor, but it's just a different approach, I would say, than oil painting. It's less forgiving, so it takes more time, basically. And I'm currently working on a couple of projects, but as far as painting go, I'm working on several ones, but certainly one that is a portrait of a woman called Harriet P. Jacobs, who was born enslaved in the 19th century in North Carolina. And she has an extraordinary story where she was harassed by her master, and she fiercely defended herself, which at the time was very unlikely. And in order to escape that harassment, she decided to start an affair with another white man who was a lawyer. She had 2 kids with him, but unfortunately, this did not stop the harassment. And eventually, she decided to escape. But what was interesting in that story is that her grandmother managed to, she was a free woman because, when she was younger, she was cooking, goods, baked goods, was able to sell them, save her money, and was able to buy her freedom. And she lives a lot of the time with her grandmother. But when she decided to escape, she decided to hide in her grandmother's house, which was on the premises of the plantation, which was extraordinary and very dangerous. And she hid in an attic, a makeshift attic that they made for her, which was 7 feet by 3. And she spent there 7 years. And she was able, after a couple of years, she found a way to pierce 2 holes in the wall, and she was able to see her kids playing outside. And I think that gave her the will to, to hang on, because there was a lot of time where she didn't want to live. And then she managed to, at some point, the situation became too dangerous. She managed to escape to New York, and eventually, after years and years and years, was able to get her kids there. And she was working for a British woman who were able to buy her freedom. And she ended up writing a book called The Incidents of a Slave Girl, which is a memoir. It's extraordinary. I would advise it to everyone. And you see her story and her journey and how difficult and rough and gruesome it was. And I decided to make a portrait of her just to honor her memory. So that's what I'm working on, among other
things. Do you want to say anything about Queenie?
Yes, I do. Queenie is interesting. It's a different medium. It's a story I encountered a few years ago. It was first told by my mother. She mentioned this woman called Stephanie McCarter, who was a woman from Martinique, born at the turn of the 20th century. And she moved to New York 1910s, very young. So she lied about her age her whole life. So it was something between 13 and 18, it's that range. But she went to New York very young, and then moved to Harlem, lived there, and became the head of an illegal lottery, which basically became head of a mafia there. And I think if I'm not mistaken, she was one of the only women, certainly the only woman in Harlem. So when I heard that story, I wanted also to do a portrait of her. I mean, it's a different kind of destiny, but it's still fascinating. But when I unpacked everything, I was like, how am I gonna really tell her whole story in a painting? And I went to the retrospective of Kerry James Marshall at the Met Breuer in 2016. And in one of the rooms, there were his graphic novels, a graphic novel called River Master that he worked in the 90s. And I thought that was interesting that Kerry James Marshall was exploring this medium to tell a story, still in line with his practice, but just another way of talking to people. So I thought it would be a very interesting medium to explore on my side. And then I thought Queenie, or Stephanie Sinclair, because Queenie was her nickname, would be a very good subject matter to explore through the medium of graphic novel. So I did that during the pandemic. I wrote the story with a friend of mine, and I drew the whole graphic novel, which is roughly 150 pages. And it was published in France this past fall. And it's going to be published in the States by the end of the year or beginning of next year, January or December of this year. And it's an incredible story, lots of ups and downs, it's so rare to have to talk about female gangsters, and it's even more rare to have a Black woman as a female gangster, and certainly even more from the Caribbean. And just that oddity really struck me, and I really, really wanted to tell her story. So I might do a portrait of her still. I did actually some drawings that are now shown at a gallery in Chelsea, but I probably will end up doing a portrait of her because I was able to ask my friends, and we talk about people who are posing for me, my friend to pose for me to incarnate Stephanie Sinclair. So it was easier also for me to through the pages to link it to somebody I knew and somebody who was alive, and it made it more alive also.
Stephanie and Olivia, I have lost track of who I'm supposed to call on next. I don't know whether either of you has a question that you'd like to go ahead and roll out.
Well, I guess I can go ahead. There is no problem. Yeah. I just want to go back to what you just said, like, for instance, in that story, like you said that oddity or like the uncanniness of these stories is something that really pulls you to create these works. And I guess my question is, reflecting on your journey as an artist, French, Martinique, now American, pardon. What has been the greatest source of joy in that journey? Like, what is something that you look back and feel like it's what gives you most of the joy? Or does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it's so profound. I don't know if I have an answer for you.
Oh, okay. I take it.
I mean, it's I don't know. I don't know what was the most joyful moment.
Or you can tell us a few if you have more than one. I'm just curious to know.
I mean, I feel like the first time I sold one painting, that was incredible to have somebody coming into, and at the time I didn't even have a proper studio. It was a room in my apartment, made like a makeshift studio, and you have somebody coming in who was a legit gallery owner, who comes in and is like, oh, I like this, how much? And you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm not prepared for this. So that was definitely an incredible moment to have somebody who has no links to me to a certain degree, who's not doing me a favor, but seeing my work and deciding, oh, yes, that is worth something. So that was definitely a moment of joy.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
I just have one last question. I know we're running out of time, and if you need to ask other questions from the attendees, that would be wonderful. But I guess, as a woman who is giving sort of voice to classical material through translation, I think my own relationship with the canon is a bit complicated at this point. And so I guess my question is, what ultimately do you think your relationship is with the, with the European canon that you are, that you're taking up, that you're refiguring in a way that you have to, you're positioning yourself in. So is it one of, are you, you're obviously positioning yourself in it, but is there a defiant element in here as well? And what ultimately is, how would you describe your relationship with the canon of which you are a part?
I would like to redefine what the canon is really. I think for the work is because it's established rules, and some of them obviously I'm following because of the craftsmanship, but the representation also is very different from what is canonical, the beauty and the canon of beauty. So I definitely place myself in it because I like to refer to it, but I'm attempted to redefine what it means in the whole scheme of things. So I think it's important to not completely reject it, but it's good to take something from it and to bend their rules, the rules of the canon.
Well, I know we've got just 1 or 2 minutes left, and there were 1 or 2 questions that I think I didn't ask particularly well. So let me go back. There's one person who specifically wants to know about female grief and lamentation and whether this is a subject matter you like to explore. And then the other one, which was a better question than I'd actually put it, was just about the question of empire and wondering whether or not, Greco-Roman mythology, I mean, to what degree does the issue of empire figure into your work? So I wonder whether those are topics you'd like to take up.
Sure. What was the first question?
It was about female grief and lamentation. Is that a subject matter you like to explore, or do you find it too restrictive as a way of thinking about women in mythology?
I think it's I wouldn't say it's restrictive. I think it's just again a way of reinterpreting what you see. There's a painting of, I believe it's Danae. I think maybe we have it in the list. I think.
I don't think that Danae was here, though I have it. I can pull it up. I have it in another PowerPoint. Would you like me to put? I can certainly pull it up.
Yes.
Give me just 1 moment. Hang on.
I'm going to talk about it in the meantime. So Danae is it's a different way of seeing the myth in all masters painting, which a lot of them, when they're representing female bodies, is just a little ploy to really represent some nudity of erotica, or and in that story of Danae, which I think is interesting, is the idea of Zeus is coming in and seducing her, and most of the representation, she is ecstatic. She is very happy that Zeus, came in without saying a thing and dropped some golden shower. She's like, "Oh, this is lovely." I thought my interpretation would be a little bit different, in the sense that you have to imagine this woman is, sheltered. Oh, there she is. She's sheltered in this. I think in the myth, it's a tower made of copper or something like that, right? And so she's, in that tower, by herself, because her father is afraid that her offspring is going to kill him. So she's prisoner. She hasn't seen anything. So, there's this man who is her father, obviously treats her horribly. And then she sees this golden dust coming from the heavens. And she's like, what is this? And this dust is going to impregnate her. You cannot tell me this is a love story. So my interpretation is more of her and her face that is dubious, a little bit puzzled, and touching this powder, just like, what is this thing again that I'm gonna have on my shoulders? And I like to explore, let's say, the plight of women in myth, but I like to reinterpret them. So it's definitely a subject matter, and and in mythology, unfortunately, a lot of women are portrayed that way. that's why I'm doing a bit of a side note here, but that's why I was so interested in that book of Circe. I don't remember the name of the writer, but the work she did by interpreting uh, this figure was extraordinary. Just it's another view of who she was. She was full-bodied, which is kind of rare when you're thinking about female protagonists in mythology. So it's just a way of telling the story differently.
If I could say something about this particular painting, because you sent this to me, I had when we spoke before, and I had not seen this. My students and I positively delighted to find the specific Greek vases that you have that you've put in here. We found them through the Metropolitan Museum of Art,
Yes.
and and we were wondering, what kind of wonderful time you had walking around the Met, working out which of those vases you were going to incorporate into this particular painting, but they were also thoughtfully incorporated. And it was sheer pleasure in figuring that out. It was wonderful.
You see the pleasure you get when you get into the adventure.
Yes, absolutely. It was great. Yes, wonderful. I love this painting. Yes, most of the time she's asleep, right? She has no idea even what's happening. So it's really nice to see this response to that myth.
Gosh, I am so sorry we're 3 minutes past the hour, and
Wow.
while I think that we could probably continue this conversation easily for another hour, and I know that I've got questions there, but it would be, I don't wish to hoard your time. And so we're going to say thank you so much.
Oh, thank
For
you.
your
I mean,
time.
time flew by. It was very quick, I feel like.
Well, then it just sounds like you'll just have to come back and talk to us again.
I feel like I do.
Well, then, that unfortunately is now on tape. And so we're going to have to hold you to that. But, Mademoiselle, merci beaucoup for your time this afternoon. We look forward to following your career. And you have made a bunch of friends here at the University of the South and friends on Zoom. Thank you so much for your time today, and good evening. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye now.